The heat shimmered off the asphalt as Marcus Reed stood frozen at the edge of his driveway, glaring at the luxury SUV that sprawled across his private space like a smug monument to everything he despised about suburban entitlement. The grocery bags in his trunk were forgotten, the sweat trickling down his temples ignored. All he could see was the gleaming pearl-white hulk of Tiffany Morgan's car, parked at an obnoxious diagonal angle that blocked not only his driveway but half the sidewalk as well. This wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. It was the 5th time in 2 weeks. At first, Marcus had believed in decency, in neighborly conversations and gentle reminders. Tiffany had played the innocent card so well, feigning shock, throwing out casual apologies, fluttering her manicured hands as if the very idea of blocking someone's driveway was beyond her comprehension. But it hadn't been an accident then, and it certainly wasn't an accident now. Marcus lived in Waverly Hills, an affluent suburb just outside of Austin, Texas, a place where people paid for the illusion of peace and civility. His corner lot house was modest compared to some of the McMansions that dotted the winding streets, but it was his. He had worked 2 jobs for years, saved religiously, and finally bought this home with its clean concrete driveway perfect for hosting his own car, his partner's vehicle, and especially visits from his aging mother, who struggled with mobility issues. Keeping the driveway clear was more than a convenience. It was essential for safety, for dignity, for independence. And Tiffany Morgan couldn't care less. She was a self-proclaimed influencer, flaunting her lifestyle on Instagram with filtered photos of smoothie bowls and morning yoga poses she likely couldn't hold for more than 10 seconds off camera. Offline, Tiffany was chaos in designer leggings, a tornado wrapped in a glossy veneer of performative politeness. She had declared herself an unofficial HOA enforcer despite holding no actual title, anointing herself judge, jury, and executioner of what she considered acceptable neighborhood behavior, which, apparently, included treating Marcus's driveway like her personal unloading zone. Marcus had tried diplomacy at first. The first few incidents were met with soft knocks on Tiffany's pristine door, met by hollow apologies and the promise it wouldn't happen again. But the pattern repeated, growing bolder each time. By the 3rd offense, Tiffany no longer bothered with apologies. She shrugged it off with condescending remarks about how he wasn't using it anyway, or how it was just for a few minutes, her tone dripping with the entitled irritation of someone being mildly inconvenienced by the concept of boundaries. The final straw wasn't even today's incident, though it certainly pushed him over the edge. It had been last week, when Marcus's mother, a proud woman who hated asking for help, had been forced to maneuver her walker around Tiffany's vehicle, nearly tripping over the curb in the process. Watching his mother struggle, burning with embarrassment, had lit a slow, cold fire inside Marcus that no apology could extinguish. Today, he wasn't going to ask nicely. Today, he was going to act. Without hesitation, Marcus marched back into his house, grabbed his phone, and pulled up the number for the local towing company. He had called ahead days ago to confirm his rights. His driveway was private property, not public easement, and the tow companies in Waverly Hills had standing arrangements with homeowners for precisely this kind of recurring offense. All he had to do was make the call. His voice was steady as he spoke to the dispatcher, detailing the make, model, and license plate of Tiffany's vehicle. By the time he returned to the porch, a lawn chair under one arm and a cold bottle of water in the other, he was smiling for the first time in days. The tow truck would be here in 30 minutes, and Marcus intended to savor every second. As he settled into his chair, Marcus thought back to how carefully he had built his life in this neighborhood. He wasn't confrontational by nature. He valued peace. But peace without respect wasn't peace at all, it was surrender. And today, he would not surrender. The low rumble of the tow truck echoed down the street long before it appeared, a squat, powerful vehicle that seemed almost to glisten in the oppressive afternoon sun. The driver, a middle-aged man with mirrored sunglasses and a no-nonsense demeanor, pulled up with the casual ease of someone who had seen far too many suburban dramas unfold. Marcus didn't even need to explain. He simply pointed at the SUV. The driver nodded once, then got to work. The mechanical clank of metal hooks and chains was music to Marcus's ears. Within minutes, Tiffany's precious luxury car was lifted ignominiously off the ground, secured tightly, ready to be hauled away. That was when the shriek split the air. Tiffany burst out of her house, barefoot and furious, her phone clutched in one hand, an oversized iced coffee in the other, sloshing liquid onto her driveway as she ran. "You can't tow my car," she screamed, her voice high and wild, drawing curtains back and faces to windows all down the street. Marcus didn't move. He simply sipped his water and watched. The tow truck driver didn't flinch either. He merely gestured at Marcus. "Private property," he said flatly. "Owner requested removal. Nothing I can do." Tiffany turned her wrath on Marcus, advancing on him like an avenging angel, face twisted in disbelief. "You're going to regret this," she screeched. Marcus tilted his head slightly, regarding her with a calm that only seemed to infuriate her further. "I don't think so," he said quietly. The driver climbed into the cab and revved the engine. Tiffany screamed again, threatening lawsuits, police, bad Yelp reviews. None of it mattered. Her SUV disappeared around the corner, leaving her standing there, trembling with rage, utterly powerless. Marcus remained seated until she retreated back into her house, slamming the door so hard the decorative wreath shook. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He simply sat back, sipped his water, and thought, finally. But in the back of his mind, a small, cautious voice whispered that Tiffany wasn't the type to give up easily. And Marcus knew, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning. The next morning, the sun rose with the brutal clarity that only Texas summers could offer, high, hot, and merciless. Marcus stepped out onto his porch, coffee in hand, breathing in the heavy air thick with the scent of cut grass and smoldering resentment. Across the street, Tiffany's house sat brooding, its windows dark, its driveway conspicuously empty. For the first time in months, Marcus's driveway lay open and free, untouched by SUV tires and unclaimed by someone else's entitlement. But peace, as he quickly learned, was not something Tiffany Morgan would surrender easily. By noon, Marcus noticed a small but telling change. A laminated sign had appeared on Tiffany's yard, jammed haphazardly into the lawn. In bold black letters, it read, "Private community parking, all neighbors welcome." It was a flimsy attempt to rewrite reality, as if a cheap sign could retroactively justify months of disrespect. Marcus simply shook his head and went back inside. He had bigger things to do than wage a battle of signs and passive aggression. But Tiffany wasn't finished. That evening, as Marcus took his trash cans to the curb, he found something far more deliberate waiting at the end of his driveway, a heap of garbage bags, a broken deck chair, and what looked suspiciously like an old yoga mat, moldy and reeking in the humid air. Perched atop the pile was a handwritten note, scrawled in aggressive red ink. "If you don't like to share, here's your space back." Marcus stared at the mess for a long moment, the streetlights casting harsh white light over the absurdity of it all. Then, without a word, he pulled out his phone. A few sharp clicks captured the scene in full detail, the garbage, the note, the bags oozing mystery liquids onto the concrete. He documented everything. Then he dragged the entire heap, bags, chair, yoga mat, and all, across the street and deposited it neatly onto Tiffany's immaculate lawn. No anger, no shouting, just slow, methodical movement. A chess player making the next inevitable move. He didn't expect applause, but he was rewarded nonetheless. A few subtle claps of window blinds snapping shut, the quick flash of a neighbor's curtain fluttering. Waverly Hills was watching. And if Marcus had learned anything, it was that silent witnesses had long memories. The next day, the escalation took a new, uglier form. A police cruiser pulled up to Marcus's house just after lunch. He answered the knock with calm he didn't feel, finding a uniformed officer on his porch, cap in hand, posture relaxed but cautious. "Good afternoon, sir," the officer began. "We received a call from your neighbor across the street. She's alleging harassment and illegal dumping." Behind the officer, halfway across the street, Tiffany lurked, arms crossed, lips pressed tight into a smug, victorious smile. Marcus didn't react. He simply invited the officer inside. Within minutes, he had pulled up the security footage on his television. Clear, time-stamped video of Tiffany dragging the garbage onto his driveway under the cover of night. He scrolled through dozens of photos documenting her months-long pattern of parking violations, complete with dates and times. He produced the printed email from the Waverly Hills zoning office affirming his driveway's status as private property. The officer watched silently, his neutral expression slipping into one of slight exasperation. When it was over, he turned back toward the door. "Sir," he said carefully, "I see no evidence you've harassed your neighbor. However, her actions could be considered illegal dumping and trespassing. Would you like to file a complaint?" Marcus thought about it for a moment. "No," he said finally. "Not yet." The officer nodded, understanding lingering in his eyes. As he left, Marcus watched Tiffany's smugness evaporate like dew under the midday sun when the officer stopped at her house next. Their conversation was brief, and when Tiffany's voice rose in angry protest, The officer merely pointed back toward Marcus's security camera before leaving her standing furious and humiliated on her own front porch. But even then, Marcus knew better than to believe Tiffany would let the matter rest. He wasn't wrong. Over the next week, a new pattern emerged. Small inconveniences layered one atop the other like passive-aggressive bricks in a wall of petty warfare. His trash can would mysteriously tip over in the night, spilling garbage across his yard. His mailbox was found hanging slightly open some mornings, mail damp from the early dew. Strange, anonymous flyers appeared stuffed into his door frame, warning about neighborhood bullies who abused their property rights. Marcus kept documenting everything. He didn't react. He didn't retaliate. He simply waited. Because Marcus understood something Tiffany did not. Escalation without evidence was just noise. But patience was a blade honed quietly over time, and when it struck, it cut clean and deep. The opportunity came faster than even Marcus expected. One evening, under a sky bruised purple and gold by the setting sun, Marcus heard the familiar rumble of Tiffany's SUV returning home. But instead of pulling into her own driveway, she swung wide and parked, once again, across his own, nose of her car boldly jutting onto the private concrete like a territorial marker. And this time, she stayed in the car, pulling out her phone, aiming it pointedly at Marcus's house, smirking. She wanted a confrontation. A scene. Something she could record, twist, post online to her followers as evidence that she was the victim of an unhinged neighbor. Marcus smiled. He went inside, called the tow company again, this time giving very specific instructions, and returned to his seat on the porch, watching as the drama unfolded. When the tow truck arrived 15 minutes later, Tiffany's smug smile faltered. She jumped out of her SUV, filming frantically, narrating her own version of events. She demanded the tow driver stop, accused Marcus of harassment, of abuse, of violating her rights as a mother and small business owner. But the tow driver wasn't interested in theatrics. He confirmed the report. He pointed to the signage Marcus had discreetly posted weeks earlier, clearly stating private property. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed at owner's expense. He even cited the municipal code Marcus had printed out and laminated near the garage. Tiffany's protests grew shrill, hysterical. And then Marcus calmly, wordlessly, lifted his phone and began recording her. The footage would later show Tiffany screeching incoherently about unconstitutional driveways and illegal parking entrapment, her voice echoing down the quiet street as neighbors peered through blinds, some even stepping onto porches to watch. It ended the way it had to, with Tiffany's SUV hauled away once again, with Tiffany standing alone on the sidewalk, screaming at a world that no longer cared. And with Marcus, serene as a statue, sipping his coffee and recording it all for posterity. Because some battles weren't won through shouting or force. Some battles were won by outlasting the storm. And Marcus Reed had no intention of moving. Not now. Not ever. The humiliation should have ended it. A normal person, after being publicly shamed not once but twice, would have retreated, licked their wounds, and found a new target for their frustrations. But Tiffany Morgan wasn't normal. She didn't view her defeats as consequences of her own arrogance. No, to her, they were injustices, a cruel world conspiring to oppress her free spirit. So she adapted. She evolved. And like any true suburban warlord armed with a smartphone and a pathological need for attention, Tiffany turned to her ultimate weapon, the internet. It started subtly at first. Marcus noticed the change one afternoon while trimming his hedges. Tiffany was standing across the street, phone held aloft, angled suspiciously toward his house. She wasn't just snapping photos. She was filming, narrating. Marcus could hear the faint, syrupy tone of her voice drifting across the street. And here's the neighbor who thinks he owns the whole block, everyone, gatekeeping driveways like he built the neighborhood himself. He didn't react, not outwardly, but a slow, cold fury began to knot itself deep in his stomach. This wasn't just childish revenge anymore. This was character assassination, a carefully curated story Tiffany was building, one Instagram post at a time, to paint herself as the martyr and Marcus as the villain. By evening, it had escalated. Tiffany posted a series of Instagram stories, tagging local community pages, using hashtags like #SuburbanTyrant and #DrivewayDictator. She twisted the narrative skillfully, clips of herself looking tearful, photos cropped to suggest Marcus's security cameras were somehow spying on her, captions dripping with faux vulnerability about toxic neighbors and bullying. Marcus wasn't surprised. Tiffany lived for the curated outrage of the internet. But he wasn't afraid either. because facts were on his side. And facts, unlike emotions, didn't crumble under scrutiny. The backlash began within hours. First came the sympathetic comments, the flood of followers offering thoughts and prayers to the poor, persecuted Tiffany. Messages urging her to stay strong, suggesting she should call a lawyer, and praising her bravery in standing up to bullies. But social media, Marcus knew, was a fickle beast. By the next morning, the tide had already begun to turn. Skeptical voices crept into the comment sections. Viewers noticed the inconsistencies. If Marcus was truly harassing her, why were there no police reports? Why was there no video of him behaving aggressively? Why did her evidence only show her own driveway empty and her own face, never any actual misconduct? The more Tiffany posted, the more she revealed, and the less convincing she became. Her attempts to rally the neighborhood against Marcus failed spectacularly too. She plastered flyers on lampposts and community bulletin boards, urging residents to boycott the tyrant across the street, but few were willing to sacrifice their own peace for Tiffany's vendetta. Most had their own stories of her entitled behavior, trash dumped in their bins, dogs running loose, unsolicited lectures about lawn maintenance. Privately, neighbors approached Marcus. They apologized for Tiffany's behavior. They offered quiet support. Some even shared their own evidence, photos and messages that painted a broader picture of her harassment campaign. Marcus collected it all. He wasn't rushing. He was building a case. Because Tiffany wasn't just embarrassing herself anymore. She was breaking the law. It was a Saturday afternoon when Tiffany made her fatal mistake. In a move so breathtakingly arrogant it almost bordered on satire, she staged a peaceful protest on Marcus's front sidewalk. She recruited two of her equally entitled friends, clad in matching pastel athleisure, and together they paraded up and down the street holding handmade signs. Stop neighbor bullying. In driveway gatekeeping. Freedom to park. Marcus watched them from his window, sipping his coffee, unmoved. They filmed themselves chanting slogans. They waved at passing cars, some of which honked in bemusement rather than support. They live-streamed the entire spectacle, desperate for attention, for validation, for some kind of viral moment that would crown Tiffany the righteous victim she believed herself to be. But they had crossed a crucial line. Sidewalk protests were legal. Trespassing onto private property was not. At some point during their march, Tiffany, caught up in her own performative fervor, stepped squarely onto Marcus's driveway, planted her sign in the ground, and posed triumphantly for her followers. The security camera caught everything. So did Marcus's phone. He made no move to stop them. He made no threats. He simply recorded, documented, collected. And then, quietly, he called the police. The responding officer was young but efficient. He listened carefully as Marcus presented his evidence. Footage of the trespassing, the protest, the harassment. He flipped through Marcus's carefully organized folder of incidents, dates, times, screenshots of Tiffany's public posts. By the time the officer crossed the street to speak with Tiffany, his mind was already made up. Tiffany, emboldened by her live stream, greeted him with a wide, fake smile. "We're exercising our First Amendment rights," she announced loudly, ensuring her followers could hear every word. The officer's response was calm, professional, and devastating. "Ma'am, the sidewalk is public property. You're allowed to protest there. However, the driveway you stepped onto is private property. Planting a sign there constitutes trespassing. You'll need to remove it immediately. And you're being cited." Tiffany's smile faltered. The live stream caught everything, the moment her confidence curdled into confusion, then into rage. She argued, pleaded, threatened to call her lawyer. She demanded the officer arrest Marcus instead, as if logic could be bullied into submission by sheer volume. It didn't work. The citation was issued. The sign was confiscated. The protest disbanded in awkward silence. And Tiffany's once adoring online audience? They turned on her in real time. Accusations of entitlement flooded her comments. Viewers mocked her meltdown, shared clips of her arrogant rants, laughed at her insistence that driveways were communal property. Within hours, Tiffany's follower count plummeted. Sponsorship deals evaporated. Brands she had once tagged eagerly in her posts issued polite but firm statements distancing themselves. She wasn't an influencer anymore. She was a punchline. And Marcus? He hadn't said a word. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply stood his ground. Silently, relentlessly, until Tiffany destroyed herself. The fall of an internet queen wasn't a quiet affair. It came with the violent, thrashing desperation of someone who had built her entire identity atop a house of cards and now stood watching the breeze carry it away. Tiffany Morgan didn't vanish into obscurity with dignity. She didn't accept the consequences of her actions like a humbled adult. No, she clawed at the remnants of her collapsing influence with the ferocity of a wounded animal. And when attention fled her, when sympathy turned to ridicule, she did what people like Tiffany always did when the mirror cracked. She found someone else to blame. Marcus Reed. The man who had simply wanted a clear driveway. The new villain in the grand tragic opera that Tiffany was determined to stage for a world that was no longer watching. The first hint of her final gambit came in the form of an envelope, thick, overly formal, and delivered by a process server who barely met Marcus's eyes as he thrust it into his hand. Inside was a lawsuit. Tiffany Morgan was suing Marcus Reed for harassment, emotional distress, and, most laughably, defamation of character. She claimed he had orchestrated a campaign to destroy her online presence, sabotage her business ventures, and tarnish her reputation in the community. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the lawsuit spread out before him, and laughed. A real, full-bellied laugh, not bitter or mocking, but incredulous, almost admiring in its audacity. Tiffany's ego truly knew no limits. He wasn't worried. Not really. He had the receipts, videos, photos, police reports, timestamps, community testimonies. He had conducted every action under the watchful eye of the law, never stepping out of line, never escalating beyond what was necessary. But still, he knew he needed to take this seriously. Because while the truth was on his side, courts ran on more than truth. They ran on evidence, on precision, on preparation. And Marcus was nothing if not prepared. He hired an attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Leah Moreno who had made a career out of dismantling frivolous lawsuits. When Marcus laid out his meticulously organized evidence, Leah raised an eyebrow, impressed. "You could teach half my clients a thing or two about documentation," she said dryly. Together, they built a countercase, a solid wall of facts and timelines and witness statements that painted a picture not of a neighbor from hell, but of a man systematically harassed by a delusional individual desperate for relevance. As the court date approached, Tiffany doubled down on her narrative. She flooded local Facebook groups with sob stories, plastered tearful selfies on community forums, begged for donations to her legal defense fund, claiming she was being bullied by a wealthy neighbor with connections. Never mind that Marcus was a modest man of simple means, hardly the corporate titan she portrayed him as. Most of the community saw through it. Some didn't. But Marcus stayed silent. Let Tiffany dig her hole. Let her keep shoveling. The day of the hearing, Marcus arrived at the courthouse early, dressed simply but neatly. Tiffany arrived 15 minutes late, sweeping into the courtroom with a cameraman in tow, recording her every dramatic sigh and martyr's gaze. The judge, a stern, unimpressed woman in her 60s, took one look at the cameraman and ordered him out. Tiffany protested, claiming public accountability, but was swiftly silenced. It was the first of many miscalculations she would make that day. Tiffany's attorney, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, laid out her case, or tried to. It quickly unraveled under the weight of its own absurdity. The judge, sharp and direct, interrupted multiple times to ask for evidence that simply didn't exist. Where were the police reports accusing Marcus of harassment? There were none. Where was the proof Marcus had defamed her? None. Had Marcus ever approached her aggressively? No. The judge's frown deepened with every hollow accusation. When it was Marcus's turn, Leah rose with quiet confidence. She presented the videos, Tiffany trespassing, Tiffany dumping trash, Tiffany screaming obscenities while being filmed. She presented the police reports, the zoning office confirmations, the neighborhood testimonials. It wasn't a case. It was an avalanche. By the time Leah finished, the courtroom was silent save for the rustle of paperwork. The judge didn't take long to rule. She dismissed Tiffany's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning it could never be refiled. She admonished Tiffany for wasting the court's time and resources. And to Tiffany's visible horror, she ordered her to pay Marcus's legal fees. It was over. Decisively. Brutally. Perfectly. Outside the courthouse, Tiffany's cameraman tried to salvage the day, filming her standing stiffly on the steps, delivering a trembling speech about injustice and censorship. But no one gathered to listen. No curious passers-by stopped. No sympathetic audience formed. Her followers had moved on. The world had moved on. And Marcus? He didn't even glance her way. He walked past her, head high, steps light, feeling, for the first time in months, truly, completely free. No more white SUVs. No more piles of garbage. No more laminated lies staked into perfectly manicured lawns. Just peace. Real, hard-earned peace. And if another Tiffany ever tried to take that from him? Well, he was ready. The absence of chaos was almost deafening. For months, the tension in Waverly Hills had been a constant thrum, a background noise that buzzed just beneath the surface of everyday life. Now, with Tiffany Morgan officially outmaneuvered, outclassed, and out of options, the entire neighborhood seemed to exhale in collective relief. Marcus Reed noticed it first in small ways. Neighbors who once hurried inside at the sight of a confrontation now lingered on their lawns, exchanging real smiles instead of tight, polite nods. Children biked past his house without glancing nervously toward Tiffany's property. The air seemed lighter, as if the very street itself had shrugged off a heavy, invisible weight. And then came the idea, small at first, almost tossed out as a joke by his neighbor Mrs. Howell, a spry widow who had lived in Waverly Hills since before Marcus was born. "We should throw a party," she said one morning, standing at the foot of Marcus's newly liberated driveway. "A proper neighborhood gathering. Celebrate taking our street back." Marcus chuckled at the time, thinking it was a sweet sentiment that would die quietly in the Texas heat. He underestimated just how hungry Waverly Hills was for closure. Within days, it had snowballed. Invitations circulated not by Tiffany's usual passive-aggressive flyers, but through genuine conversations, phone calls, friendly knocks on doors. Tables were planned, potlucks organized, a bounce house rented for the kids. Someone even suggested a dunk tank. "Put a blonde wig on a mannequin," one neighbor joked, sending the group chat into hysterics. Marcus didn't seek the spotlight. He never had. But somehow, he found himself at the center of it all, the reluctant symbol of a community that had remembered it didn't have to live under the thumb of petty tyranny. And on a blazing Saturday afternoon, Waverly Hills celebrated its rebirth. The block party sprawled across 3 streets, a sea of folding tables laden with casseroles, pies, lemonade pitchers, and coolers brimming with soda and beer. Children shrieked with laughter as they tumbled through sprinklers and raced along the sidewalks. Music, old rock classics and upbeat country songs, floated through the air, accompanied by the rhythmic slap of cornhole bags hitting wooden boards. Marcus moved through the crowd, laughing, shaking hands, accepting plates piled high with homemade food he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. Everywhere he turned, someone was thanking him, not just for standing up to Tiffany, but for reminding everyone else that they could too. "You gave us permission," Mr. Patel from 2 houses down said, clapping Marcus on the back. "We all needed it. We were tired. Just tired of feeling bullied in our own homes." Marcus shook his head modestly. "I just wanted my driveway back." "And you got it," Mr. Patel said, grinning. "And you gave us back our neighborhood." Toward the center of the street, a long white banner stretched between 2 trees. Hand-painted in bright red and blue letters, it read, "Waverly Hills, stronger together." Beneath it, a small table had been set up, a makeshift hall of fame, displaying printed screenshots of Tiffany's most absurd online posts, laminated for posterity. The highlight was a freeze frame from her courthouse livestream meltdown, immortalized forever in the community's collective memory. Next to the table, someone had placed a driveway cone wrapped in tinsel, labeled, "In memory of parking rights lost and regained." Marcus couldn't help but laugh. It was perfect, absurd, petty, and absolutely cathartic. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of fire and gold, Marcus found himself standing by the barbecue pit, a paper plate balanced in one hand, a cold beer in the other. Mrs. Howell wandered over, her walker adorned with streamers. "You know," she said, nudging him playfully, "you could run for the HOA board now. I think you'd win in a landslide." Marcus nearly choked on his beer. "God, no," he said once he regained his breath. "One neighborhood dictator is enough for a lifetime." She laughed, a clear, sharp sound that turned a few heads and drew more smiles. "You're right," she said. "We don't need a new queen. We just needed to remember we already have power." She patted his arm warmly, then shuffled off to join a group gathered around a game of horseshoes. Marcus stood there for a moment, watching the scene unfold. Real community, unforced, unpoliced, thriving simply because no one was trying to control it. And for the first time in months, he let himself believe it was real, that the peace wasn't temporary, that the street, the laughter, the freedom to come and go without fear of confrontation All of it had been won not with screaming matches or passive-aggressive signs, but with patience, perseverance, and unyielding respect for the truth. He took a long sip of his beer, breathing deep the warm, sweet air of a summer night that belonged, finally, to him and his neighbors again. As the first fireworks cracked across the sky, small, bright, defiant bursts against the darkening canvas, Marcus smiled. It wasn't just a victory over Tiffany Morgan. It was a reclamation of respect, of space, of peace. And somewhere deep down, he knew, no matter what future Karens, Tiffany's, or suburban tyrants might appear, Waverly Hills would never bow so easily again. Not after this. Not ever.